our chapter 13 and pick up where we left off. Like I said, some of what we're going to talk about tonight is going to be review. It's always good to get a little bit of review in here. When last we left off, we were talking about the blood-brain barrier. Now, this should look familiar to you because we talked about the blood-brain barrier back in chapter 12. And it's important that you understand the purpose of the blood-brain barrier, right? Especially if you're going into pharmacology, there are certain drugs that are able to get across the blood-brain barrier. There's certain toxins and poisons, right? But the job of the blood-brain barrier is to protect, right, the brain from harmful substances. And so this structure is going to regulate what enters into the brain and what leaves the brain. All right, so what is the triple B, the blood-brain barrier? All right, it's made up of endothelial cells. Wait a minute, what are those? Those are simple squamous cells. All right, so we have our endothelial cells that cover our capillaries. So they surround, well, that's what our capillaries are made up of these endothelial cells. Right? And these endothelial cells have these structures called tight junctions. And those are, right, the spaces in between the cells, you'll have these tight junctions that will hold these cells close to one another. Because if you can't go through the cell, why don't you go around the cell? Well, these tight junctions help to prevent things from going around the cell. Interesting fact about the capillaries, they have a thicker than normal basement membrane. Remember, all epithelium sits on top of the basement membrane. There are exceptions, okay, but this is not one of them. And in fact, the basement membrane in this scenario is thicker. And then we have our astrocytes, which are our glial cells that sit outside of the capillaries, and they have these extensions that shoot off of the cell body, and they wrap around, right, these capillaries, and they're called perivascular feet. They're like these little foot-like extensions there, and they can manipulate, all right, the cells, so they can allow things to escape from the capillary, and they can prevent others from escaping. All right, so we're going to see the blood-brain barrier found throughout, right, various locations in your brain. Right, we'll see them around the choroid plexus. Okay, because remember, right, how do we produce cerebral spinal fluid? Well, we need blood. So our ependymal cells will filter out, okay, that blood and the plasma and keep the red blood cells in your capillary here. So we'll see, right, the blood-brain barrier located throughout. All right. So here you can see your blood-brain barrier. Zoom in here. So you can see all these different stuff that's traveling through the capillary. Okay, nice red blood cells, some glucose molecules, some lipid molecules. All right. Here is the endothelium, our simple squamous cells. And then we can see we have our basement membrane here. And on the other side, you have your perivascular feet. And the perivascular feet can manipulate what is able to leave. Now, certain things don't need any help leaving. Like if you're a lipid-soluble substance, you can just diffuse right through the plasma membrane because it's made up of phospholipids. So that will just leave the capillary. But other things are tougher. Obviously, an erythrocyte's not going to be able to get out because that's too big. Glucose, right? Alcohol, certain things can just travel right through. Other things can't, like bacteria, right? We don't want that getting out. Certain viruses, we don't want that getting out. All right, so keep in mind, it's tougher for certain structure, or not structures, but certain substances to move out of the capillary. And that's by design. All right, quick review here of the cerebrum, the first region in the brain that we covered. So all complex intellectual functions are found here. What are some of those intellectual functions? All right, listed below. Thought, decision-making, personality, intelligence, reasoning, right? Some of our memories, voluntary motor control in the cerebrum, right? Visual, auditory, gustatory, taste, olfactory, smell. All right, all of these are found here in the cerebrum. All right, so we have our two cerebral hemispheres. I'm going to move through this kind of quickly here. Our left and right cerebral hemisphere, which is separated by the longitudinal fissure. Inside of the longitudinal fissure, you're going to find a structure there, right? It's called the cranial dural septa. What is that? That is a sheet of thick dura mater, which is one of the cranial meninges. All right, it's there to help separate the two hemispheres from one another. It also helps to support the brain. So the longitudinal fissure will divide both those hemispheres, but there is a connection between the hemispheres, right? Those, what we call the name of those fibers that connect one hemisphere to the other, we call those commissural hemispheres. The largest one is called the Corpus Callosum. We'll go through that today in our labeling. It's the largest commissural tract that connects the right and left cerebral hemispheres. All right, we know that specific parts of our cerebrum will have specific functions. Perfect example, the occipital lobe has visual functions. The temporal lobe has auditory functions. All right, so we'll see that certain regions will have specific functions and certain regions will have multiple functions. We have a pretty good idea where most of these regions are in the brain. We've done brain mapping, we've used imaging studies to help show us, like when we're trying to stimulate certain functions, or like if you're thinking or if you're singing, different functions to see what areas of the brain become active. So we have a pretty general idea of where those areas, when I say we got a gosh darn good area, but it's not the same for every single person. All right, so when we're talking about some of these functions and these connections here, we talked about how one side of the body, right, will control the other side, one side of the brain will control the other side of the body. And so a lot of these connections will cross over. And we'll get into more detail when we get to chapter 14. We'll also see how some of these higher order functions, right, will be found on one side of your brain or the other side. Okay, we call that cerebral lateralization there, right? And the famous one is speech. Okay, that's usually on the left side. All right, so here you can see we've already seen this picture. I'm going to skip through that. Let's talk about the 5 lobes here real fast. We know what they're named for because of the cranial bones that lay over those lobes there. So we have 5 lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and insular. That's the inside or invisible lobe. Frontal lobe is going to be on the anterior portion of the cerebrum. All right, the borders for it, the posterior border, is going to be made up by the central sulcus. Just in front of the central sulcus, we have our precentral gyrus. That is our primary motor cortex that is going to be in charge of voluntary movement, which means, all right, that will control skeletal muscle. The inferior portion of the frontal lobe, its border is the lateral sulcus. That's going to be found in between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, which is inferior to that. All right, so some more of the frontal lobe functions. We already talked about motor control, voluntary motor control, concentration, verbal communication, decision-making, planning, and personality. So our parietal lobe, which is posterior to the frontal lobe, so its anterior border is going to be the central sulcus. And then the posterior inferior border, right, is going to be found just in front of the occipital lobe. So we have a sulcus over there called the parietal occipital sulcus. And then down below the lateral border is the lateral sulcus. Think of the parietal lobe for sensory functions. Temporal lobe is going to be inferior to the frontal and the parietal lobe, right? That's just below the lateral sulcus. Hearing and smell for the temporal lobe. Occipital lobe on the backside of the cerebrum for vision and visual memories. And then the insula is going to be inside. If you pull apart the temporal lobe away from the parietal lobe, you'll see the insula, and that is going to be for memory and taste. The next region of the brain is the diencephalon. There's three parts: the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. So the epithalamus is made up of two structures, the pineal gland and the habenular nuclei. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, and that has to do with your sleep-wake cycles or your day-night cycles, which we call the circadian rhythm. The habenular nuclei is going to help, think of it as a relay point, is going to relay signals, all right, from the limbic system, and you know there's various parts of the limbic system, to the midbrain. That's the first part, or the most superior portion of your brain stem, right? And so the habenular nuclei is involved in visceral responses to smells and emotional responses to smells. So what is a visceral response? If you smell something delicious, you start to salivate. There you go. Emotional response, you smell something that's delicious and you get happy. All right, the thalamus. Where's the term? There it is. There it is. Relay. All right. The thalamus is the relay center. Okay. So there's two thalami. You have one on the right, one on the left. They're oval. They look like a football. Okay. And they'll sit on either side of the third ventricle. They're connected by some gray matter. We call it the interthalamic adhesion. It'll connect the right thalamus to the left thalamus. All right. In the thalamus, again, this will become more obvious, and I hate to do this to you folks. This will become more obvious when we cover the spinal cord and we learn about all the different tracks here. But for right now, just know that in the thalamus, you have the thalamic nuclei. And so when you have these tracks that are ascending up into the brain there, all right, their neurons are going to synapse in these thalamic nuclei. And what will happen is those thalamic nuclei will then project another another neuron out to a specific or particular region of the cortex. Meaning, if it is a sensory tract that is bringing in, all right, touch sensation, for example, or sensory information regarding touch, vibration, all right, we're going to send that to the parietal lobe. And so it'll go up to the somatosensory cortex. If it's something that has to do with vision, all right, then from the thalamus, it'll send that neuron from the thalamus back to the occipital lobe. All right, so that's what we're seeing here. The thalamus is going to send those signals to the appropriate part of the cortex. While doing that, okay, it'll also act as a filter. Right, and then this is the story where I told you of a cousin of mine who could study and read a textbook in a crowded area. Guy did it all the time. All right, he could do it in the lunchroom. He could sit in there and study all day long. Wasn't a problem. So here's a nice picture of the thalamus. Right, you can see it's an oval structure. Okay, there's two of them, and there it is. There's the connection. There's the interthalamic adhesion there. And all this is these structures are made up of nuclei, and the nuclei are going to be that conglomeration or the clustering of cell bodies. So there's going to be synapsing going on. All right, the third part of the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. This is the master gland. All right, the hypothalamus has a physical connection to the pituitary gland. We call that the infundibulum. I'm going to show you that today here in a few moments when we start to do some labeling here. So let's talk about some of the various functions of the hypothalamus. It plays a huge role in the autonomic nervous system. Your nervous system is broken down into two parts. You got the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. All right, your autonomic nervous system, that's the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. All right, that have to do with fight and flight and rest and digest and all that fun stuff. All right, so the autonomic nervous system is going to influence how fast or slow your heart beats. Right? If you have high or low blood pressure, right? When it is time to digest that apple pie that you just ate, and your respiration, your breathing. All right, the endocrine system, that's the chemical control center of your body. All right, and so it controls the endocrine system. It is going to influence, all right, the secretion of hormones that are going to cause other glands and tissues to secrete their hormones. In this case, the hypothalamus is going to secrete hormones that are going to influence the anterior pituitary gland to release some of its hormones. And then that will affect other tissues and other parts of the body. You get to learn about that in chapter 17. All right, it also will make the antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. And then it transports it, utilizing this structure here, the infundibulum, down to the pituitary gland, and it stores it in the posterior pituitary. And then it'll stimulate the release of those hormones, all right, with hormones of its own. And then the pituitary gland will secrete it out. All right, body temperature regulation. If you get too hot or too cold, the hypothalamus is going to create certain changes, normally through a negative feedback loop, on how to generate heat or how to get rid of heat to cool down. All right, if you're hungry or thirsty, hypothalamus takes care of that because it's constantly monitoring in your blood the nutrient levels and the amount of concentration of dissolved substances. If you have an increased concentration of dissolved substances, it means you're too concentrated. We need to get more water in there, so you become thirsty. All right, circadian rhythms are also going to be governed by the hypothalamus, and it'll stimulate the pineal gland to secrete melatonin, which will help with your circadian rhythms. And then it is part of our limbic system, so it will play a role in emotional behavior. It will help to control some of your responses to certain emotions. So here you can see our hypothalamus. Here is our thalamus. So inferior and anterior to the thalamus is the hypothalamus. All right, and then this is the pituitary gland down here. And then you can see the infundibulum, that physical connection between those two structures there. All right, the brainstem. Okay, the brainstem, we just talked about this, okay? So this is going to be the structure that sits on the inferior portion. It's the stem, literally, of your brain there that connects the three regions of your brain, the cerebrum, diencephalon, and the cerebellum. It connects all of those to the spinal cord. So it has the sensory and motor tracts that travel through the entirety of the brainstem. That means it goes through the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. All right, we'll skip the pictures because we've already seen. Midbrain here, the cerebral peduncles have to do with our motor tracts, the pyramidal system. That has to do with voluntary movements there, right? So those voluntary movements get initiated in the primary motor cortex. Then the midbrain has its own direct line to the cerebellum, and that's through the superior cerebellar peduncles. We have a sensory tract called the medial lemniscus. This travels all the way up through the brainstem into the midbrain here. All right, then we have our Substantia Niagara. This is the structure that actually produces dopamine, and that influences muscle movements, emotional responses, pleasure and pain responses. A decrease or damage to the Substantia Niagara will cause a decrease in dopamine, all right, and then we can get a condition called Parkinson's disease. All right, the tegmentum, right, that is going to be found just posterior to the Substantia Niagara, and this has to do with postural motor control. Also involves our reticular formation, which we already talked about, and we'll review here in a second. Cerebral aqueduct is that connecting canal that connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, surrounded by our periaqueductal gray. Cranial nerves 3 and 4 have their nuclei here in the midbrain. And then on the posterior portion of our midbrain, we have our tectum. So when we're looking on it straight on, it's a plate that has 4 bumps on it. The top 2 are called the superior colliculi. The bottom 2 are called the inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi have to do with visual reflexes and when you're tracking movement of something. And then the inferior colliculi has to do with the auditory reflexes there, like someone calling your name behind you and you turning to see who it is. All right, the second region or part of the brainstem is the pons. All right, again, we'll still see sensory and motor tracts moving through here, all right, that are going to connect your brain to the spinal cord. The pons has its own line of communication to the cerebellum via the middle cerebellar peduncles. We have our pontine respiratory center that has to do with regulation of your skeletal muscles, allows for smooth transitions in the process of breathing. Our superior olivary nuclei has to do with sound localization. Okay, same thing. You hear something, all right, that's in a general area. It doesn't necessarily have to be behind you, right? And the superior olivary nuclei helps you to locate where that sound is coming from. All right, trigeminal, abducens, facial, and vestibular cochlear nerves, those are cranial nerves 5 through 8. Their nuclei are located here in the pons. All right, the last part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. It is the most inferior portion of the brainstem. Just below that, or inferior to that, is the spinal cord. All right, again, we'll see, all right, sensory and motor tracts, all right, traveling through the medulla oblongata as it moves to the brain and to the spinal cord there. Anteriorly, you'll notice two bumps on the anterior surface. Those are called the pyramids. All right, they are going to house the cortical spinal tracts, again, for motor control, specifically for voluntary motor control. And here's where we'll see some of those fibers, not all of them, but some of them crossing over. Where they cross over is called the decussation of the pyramids. And that's where we're going to see how one side of the cerebral cortex will control the other side of the body. Lateral to the pyramids are the olives. They contain the inferior olivary nucleus, and that has to do with proprioception. This is where we're going to relay that proprioceptive information to the cerebellum, so it helps to fine-tune certain activities and movements there. And then our inferior cerebellar peduncle is the direct line of communication between the medulla oblongata to the cerebellum. All right, our medulla oblongata has some of our autonomic nuclei. All right, the cardiac center is going to regulate the output to the heart. We call that cardiac output. All right, the vasomotor center has to do with blood pressure. That will regulate blood pressure, blood vessel diameter. We can vasodilate or vasoconstrict the blood vessels, and that will influence our blood pressure. The medullary respiratory center, right, that will then regulate and control our breathing rates. Right, it also has a connection and communicates with the pontine respiratory center there. And then, of course, we'll see the remaining nuclei of our cranial nerves here in the medulla oblongata. We got cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve 10, vagus, cranial nerve 11, accessory, and hypoglossal, which is cranial nerve 12. And then we have our nucleus cuneatus and the nucleus gracilis, in which these structures are going to receive ascending sensory information, all right, that is somatic in nature, all right, what we can consciously perceive. And then here, once those neurons synapse in the nucleus cuneatus and the nucleus gracilis, all right, they will, the neurons that come to synapse there will synapse onto another neuron, and that other neuron will travel through the medial lemniscus all the way up to the thalamus. All right, the last region here of our brain is the cerebellum. All right, the cerebellum has two cerebellar hemispheres, a left and a right. In the middle of those cerebellar hemispheres is the vermis. It is responsible for receiving sensory information, all right, in regards to your torsal positioning, movement, and balance there. All right. When we're looking at the cerebrum, if we dissect it through in a mid-sagittal cut, we'll see that the outer tissue is a gray matter, and that's called the cerebellar cortex. Deep to that is our white matter, and that's the arbor vitae, and then scattered throughout, we'll have pockets of gray matter, and those are going to be the cerebellar nuclei there. All right, here are the three cerebellar peduncles. We're already familiar with that. All right, the functions of the cerebellum is correction, fine-tuning, coordination of movements. There's lots of different ways for me to say that, but basically what the cerebellum does is that it ensures that muscles follow the correct pattern. And it does so by learning. So we can also store information, memories here, in addition to the premotor cortex. All right, but this is where we start to get movements. As you improve, we start to become smoother, more coordinated. Also, in the cerebellum, this is what helps us to maintain our equilibrium and posture. Some people will refer to that as balance, because it gets that proprioceptive biofeedback information from your muscles and joints, and it's able to make corrections, all right, through that sensory feedback here. So essentially, all right, it acts as an error corrector, and it makes sure, all right, that you can fix any issues. That's perfect. This is where I want to stop for tonight on cranial nerves. We'll finish up the brain in our next class talking about the cranial nerves. So if you have your atlas available, I'd like for you to take it out right now, and we'll finish up part of our, there we go. Let me see if I can find where I left off. I left off, I think it was the infundibulum. There we go. Nope. All right, this is where I left off last class. Okay, we were talking about the diencephalon, and the diencephalon is made up of the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the epithalamus. The epithalamus has two parts to it, the habenular nuclei and the pineal gland, and this is showing the pineal gland. Here it is on this model. Let me just show it on this other model. All right, so here's the pineal gland. It's more towards the posterior portion of the third ventricle there. So the pineal gland is responsible for producing melatonin. Okay, you'll notice, all right, right here in the front region, wait, that's not, I don't want to do that. Sorry, there we go. All right, so here is our third ventricle. I'll get into more specifics, but if you recall, this is the hypothalamus. Right in here is the thalamus. The hypothalamus is here. And there's a structure right here, this white structure. That is known as the optic chiasm. I'm not, well, quickly, I'll try to draw this out. All right, so you have one eyeball, your other eyeball. This is awful, I apologize. Okay, and then you have the optic nerve from one eye that's moving posterior. You have the optic nerve from another eye moving posterior, and they meet up with one another. All right, so here's one eyeball. There's a lens. There's another lens. Okay, so anyways, this part is called the optic nerve. So if this is anatomically correct, this is our left eye. This will be our right eye. Okay, so that's our left optic nerve. This is your right optic nerve. Well, anyways, both those optic nerves move back towards the brain, and they converge in this area here. All right, that area there is called the optic chiasm. So neurons, some of them in the optic nerve will cross over to the other side of your brain. Not all of them, notice, some will cross over. Others will stay on the same side. We'll talk more about that later. But the optic chiasm, majority of the neurons will cross over. Something about, I want to say about 80%. So that's what the optic chiasm is. Below the optic chiasm, immediately below it, is the pituitary gland. So some folks can get an adenoma, which is a tumor that can grow on certain structures. Well, an adenoma of the pituitary gland, if it grows here, it can get bigger and bigger, and it can start to press on the optic chiasm. So these folks that have those issues or will have an adenoma, right, that can press on the optic chiasm. It can start off with visual issues. And in fact, I was telling this story, and a student of mine last semester, her mother has an adenoma, pituitary adenoma. And the same thing happened. She started off with visual issues. Okay, so that connection, that physical connection between our hypothalamus, which is all right here, okay? That physical connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is the infundibulum. The infundibulum. All right. Now, if you recall, I was telling you folks about those commissural fibers that cross over from one cerebral hemisphere to the other cerebral hemisphere. And the largest commissural fibers are known as the corpus callosum. So they allow the left and right cerebral hemispheres to communicate with one another. That's this whole structure right here. Those are the commissural fibers. Corpus callosum. Here you can see it on this other model. All right. And there, that blue structure is the choroid plexus. That is that structure that's loaded with capillaries and ependymal cells. And that's what generates and makes our cerebral spinal fluid. That's the choroid plexus. Now, the septum pellucidum, if you recall, I was last class, I was talking to you folks about the ventricle system. And you have the left and right lateral ventricles. Well, the tissue or the structure that separates the right lateral ventricle from the left lateral ventricle is the septum pellucidum. The septum pellucidum is found in between the left and right ventricles. It separates both of them. Here you can see it on this model. There's the fornix, that white structure that you see there. That is part of our limbic system. Remember, the limbic system is scattered all around. All right, the diencephalon, well, it utilizes multiple structures that are scattered around parts of the diencephalon and parts of the cerebrum there. And the fornix helps to some of these multiple structures to communicate to one another. Here you can see the fornix on this model. All right, down to the brain stem. Here you can see the first part of your brain stem right here. There's the midbrain right there. And you can see the cerebral aqueduct going right through the midbrain there. So there's the midbrain. I'll show you on this other model here. Hold on. All right. I thought I did have another picture here of the midbrain. So what I am showing you here is the tectum. So what that arrow is pointing to, I'm going to show you, this is a posterior view of the midbrain, or my best reproduction of it. That arrow is pointing to these two top bumps. Okay, so this is supposed to be two bumps up here and then two bumps down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this area here and I'm going to turn it so you're looking at it from the back like that. So what you're seeing is the superior colliculi. And so the full term is the superior colliculi of the corpora quadremina. It's a lot to take in, I know. Superior colliculi of the corpora quadremina. The corpora quadremina is this whole thing. It's the tectal plate. All right, then below it is the inferior colliculi of the corpora quadremina. The superior colliculi has to do with the visual reflexes and tracking. The inferior colliculi have to do with auditory reflexes. All right. This is the other one I was trying to show you, the other midbrain model there. So all of this is the midbrain right here. All right, then the second part of the brainstem, just below the midbrain, is the pons. And you can see it's got this anterior bulge, how it's bulging anteriorly there. All right, the pons sits right in front or anterior to the fourth ventricle here and the cerebellum. Inferior to the pons is the medulla oblongata. It's the inferior most portion of your brainstem, and the spinal cord is just inferior to that. The medulla oblongata. All right, that's it for the labeling for this evening. So we will